Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. And today I have a special show for you because I am joined by creative writer, award-winning speaker, and Armenian genocide researcher, Ashley Kalagian Blunt. Ashley also did stand-up comedy for a while, so we're going to be talking to her about writing her books about the Armenian genocide and anything else that she would like to talk about. So Ashley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on your wonderful show. I really appreciate it.
Well, why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm originally from Canada and I live in Australia now. I've also lived in South Korea, Peru, and Mexico, and I worked there for a few years. I'm now a published author, and it took me a lot of years to get there. And I also now teach creativity, and I really enjoy teaching creativity because I think that, you know, I had dreams of being a published author and writing as a career, but I really believe that, you know, we're all creative creatures. Humans just are creative. I think as adults, we tune that out a little bit and we get out of practice, but it's actually really important to engage with our creativity just for our own personal well-being. So even if you're not aiming to have a career in a creative area like I was, I think engaging with your creativity is such a wonderful thing to do. And whether that's, you know, writing or visual arts or baking or gardening or, you know, whatever it is, I encourage people to connect with their creativity and embrace it. And my life is so much richer and so much better because I chose to do that, even though it was, in terms of making that a career, that was a very hard road.
Tell us how you got into writing and creativity in the first place.
Well, I always wanted to be a writer. Like when I was a little kid, like even in grade 1, I wrote little stories and I was always writing like, terrible poems through high school. And I wrote a terrible novel through high school. And I thought, you know, that's what I was going to do. But then my parents wanted me to study something that was an actual job. So I assumed I would kind of do an English degree, and they were like, no, that's not a job. You need to study something that's an actual job. So I did a degree in journalism. And basically the main thing I learned is that I was not, you know, the right type of personality for journalism at all. I really didn't like the short deadlines. I didn't like having to interview people who didn't necessarily want to be interviewed. Like I love interviewing someone if they're keen to talk to me. But when you're a journalist, you have to get people to talk, especially when they don't want to. And that was just not for me. So I got out of university at the age of 22 and was like, well, this is not the career choice for me. So that's when I moved abroad, and I was still writing a little bit just for fun here and there. And then I got married and I moved to Australia. And that's when I got really seriously interested in researching my great-grandparents' survival of the Armenian genocide. And I thought, this is the book I want to write. This is something that's really meaningful to me. I think it's really important for people to know more about and understand more about. And so at that time, you know, I was pretty young, I was 26, 27. I thought, okay, so I've got to just take a couple of years, do the research, write this book, and then I'll send it to a publisher. They'll, you know, see it's a great book and they'll publish it and I'll make money. And that's what's going to be my career. I had this really, really naive idea of, you know, and I didn't think that would be easy. I knew that would be hard work, but I thought I just need to follow these steps and this will happen. So I interviewed over 140 people in 3 countries, like all of my Armenian family in Canada. My great-grandparents were no longer alive, but I interviewed the family to sort of learn about them and their story. I connected, by that time I'd moved to Sydney, Australia, and I did a master's degree in Armenian diaspora and cultural identity. So to better understand how Armenian people who have never lived in Armenia, how they understand themselves as Armenian. I interviewed a bunch of people in the Sydney community. Sydney has a big Armenian community. And I went to Armenia and I spent 2 months traveling there. Paid for this all myself, interviewed anyone who would talk to me. So anyone who either spoke English or who I could get a translator. And the American Peace Corps were fantastic. They were doing such great work there, and they would translate for me. They connected me with really interesting people. So I ended up, that whole trip, I just went around to all the different Peace Corps workers and just met a bunch of fabulous Americans, which I loved. So I had all this material, and then I was like, all right, now I'm going to write this book. So I didn't even know. I had taken some writing courses and things, and so I'd studied writing, and obviously as a journalist, like I was doing a lot of writing in my degree, and I'd even won a few little awards for my writing. So I thought I knew what I was doing, and but I didn't even know the basics of like how long should a book be from a first-time author, like this sort of book. And so I wrote this thing, and it was 200,000 words, and that was way too long because it should have been more like 80,000 words, maybe 90. So that's my tip out there for the aspiring authors who are listening right now. But then I started, trying to figure out, okay, now what do I do with this thing? And I was getting feedback on it from established authors. I was paying for manuscript assessments. I was doing some writing courses, and draft by draft, I worked that down to 75,000 words, which was a much better length. And then I was sending that out to unpublished manuscript awards, because that's one way you can gain the attention of publishers, is to win an unpublished manuscript award in a recognized competition. And it was shortlisted for a few of those, which was really, really rewarding for me. And then some publishers read it. But because I'm living in Australia, right? So I'm looking at the Australian publishing industry. And some publishers read the book and they were like, the writing's really good, but there's just no market for a book about Armenia in Australia. So I spent all this time, writing this book, and I hadn't even thought about, how am I going to convince people to want to read it? And specifically, how am I going to convince publishers to want to buy it effectively? And that was a really important lesson for me. So the next book I wrote, that book sat on a shelf then for a little bit. The next book I wrote, I thought, all right, well, what do Australians want to read about? They want to read about Australia. So I wrote a book called How to Be Australian. Very, very different book, because like you said, I was doing stand-up comedy at the time. So this was a very comedic book. A lot of my stand-up comedy acting sort of worked those jokes into the book. And I wrote this book that is very much for Australians. It's a memoir of moving here with my husband, and being from Canada, I kind of thought, oh, well, Australia and Canada, they're both part of the Commonwealth. Like we both got the Queen on our money. We speak English. It's, Australia is basically just hot Canada. And then I got here and I realized, oh no, Australia and Canada are actually quite different countries. There's much more different than just the weather. So the book is sort of a learning process of like what makes Australia unique and how do you fit into Australia. And it sort of holds a mirror up for Australians to sort of look at all the weirdness and wackiness of their country. And I was able to get that. I sent that book out to publishers. I was able to get that book published. And I was able to do events around Australia and connect with Australians, and that was great. Now, I still had this other book, my Armenia book, and I'd done all this research and I'd had all this material, and I thought there has to be a way to get Australians interested in this and to make publishers want to publish it, make readers want to read it. And so one of the things I discovered in my research was that because it was the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government that decided they would systematically annihilate the Armenian communities during World War I when they were allied with Germany. The Turkey rose out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turkish government sort of holds that responsibility and continues to deny to this day that any of that happened, even though there's so much written documented evidence, both in Turkish National Archives and around the world, US archives, Australian archives. And that's all been, published and written about and studied by academics, and it's all available for anyone who wants, to find that evidence. But the Turkish government, they live in their own reality. They continue to deny this. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was actually a series of international terrorist attacks, and these took place around the world. And these were a couple of groups of Armenian men who believed that they could force the Turkish government to acknowledge the genocide by attacking Turkish diplomats in other countries. So this happened in the United States, across Europe, across the Middle East, and even here in Australia. So December 1980, broad daylight, the Turkish consul general and his bodyguard are assassinated, like in the middle of the street in this quiet seaside neighborhood. And that was a huge event in Australia. And that murder is still unsolved. Like, they know the terrorist group did it, but in terms of the particular individuals, no one's ever been caught and tried. So I realized this was my hook. I could start there with this event that happened, in Sydney, and hook Australians into this story. So I wrote a fictional version of this. I fictionalized the men who had committed this attack. And that was my plan, was to write from the terrorist point of view. And the reason why I chose to do that was because when I read about these terrorist attacks, it was the first time I'd ever read about terrorism and connected so deeply with the motives of the terrorists, because I was writing about the Armenian genocide and its denial for the same reasons that they had committed these attacks. Now, obviously, I didn't agree with their methods at all, abhorrent actions that they took, but I did understand why they did it. And I wanted the same justice that they wanted. And so I wrote this book from the point of view of the terrorists. I actually went back to university. I did another master's degree because I felt that was a very confronting project. And I wrote this as fiction, and then I wove into the book. There are a few essays waiting to explain that history and how the Armenian genocide was the predecessor to the Holocaust of World War II, and its continuing role in geopolitics today. So those books came out sort of one after the other in 2019 and 2020, and that was really the start. After it had been 10 years since I started writing that first book, but I felt like, yes, I was finally achieving the career that I really wanted to achieve.
Let's take a quick break.
Okay, everybody, it's Michael E. Cullen II.
And I'm Sesame and Carta from the All Too Real 2 podcast. We're passionate about movies, TV, and pretty much all things pop culture.
Dive into the chaos of failed sitcoms, direct-to-video sequels, and the quirky realms of cinema and TV.
Join us every Thursday for your dose of All Too Real 2 entertainment.
We'll guide you through debates like whether Howard the Duck qualifies as a superhero.
Ponder if Larry the Cable Guy could be the new Rock or Schwarzenegger.
Discover if some shows and movies should have stayed in the cutting room.
Ever heard of a sitcom featuring that dictator with the funny mustache? Well, we watched it.
We're dedicated to unraveling the peculiarities of pop culture, sometimes with awesome guests.
So, if you're into the eccentric world of pop culture,
listen and subscribe to All Too Real 2.
Available wherever you find podcasts
and on Age of Radio.
Well, your second book, How to Be Australian, why did you decide to write it as a memoir?
Well, it was based on my experiences. At first, I didn't started as a memoir. At first, I actually started it as, just a collection of fun essays about different topics related to Australia. Like I have one on the snakes and the spiders and the sharks and how we got attacked by a giant 7-legged spider in our apartment one day, had to fight it off with a vacuum cleaner. But the feedback I got, this is one of the things I've learned as a writer and as a creative, is the more feedback you can get from people who know what they're doing. So, not like your friend or your mom, but like someone who's qualified in that field and can give you informed feedback. The more feedback you can get early in a project, the better you're going to be able to conceptualize it as you go. And that was the mistake I made with that first book. I wrote 200,000 words before I got any feedback. It took me 2 years. This one, I was getting feedback, before I'd even written a first draft, halfway through the first draft. And the feedback I was getting was the best parts of the book were the parts that were from my own experience and about my life. And that perhaps the simplest way to tell that story would just be as a straight memoir. Like here's the day, we start on the day that we arrived in Australia, talk a little bit about why we came to Australia, from Winnipeg, Canada, where it was the winter I decided to leave Winnipeg, Canada. It was a minus 40-degree winter. And people always say, is that Fahrenheit or Celsius? At minus 43, they're the same. They equal out. It's a weird math thing. So it was minus 40, and I was like, that's it. Like, I'm leaving the city for good. I will never move back there. I want to go somewhere warm with beaches and sunshine and palm trees. So that's where the book starts, and the book continues on then until my husband and I ended up getting citizenship here in Sydney. So it sort of tells that journey of how we came to understand ourselves as part of Australia.
Ashley, tell us about your chronic illness. You live with a chronic illness. Tell us about what it is, when you got diagnosed, how it affects your life in all aspects, including your writing.
Oh, thanks for asking about that. Yeah, so I have chronic fatigue syndrome, which is, one of these illnesses that isn't well understood by medical science. So there's a lot of uncertainty around it. And there's 2 ways it can happen to you. One is that something triggers it, and something triggers that change in your body. And that could be cancer, that could be a concussion, that could be some sort of infection, like a virus. So something triggers it, and it comes on very suddenly. So maybe you had a concussion and you recover from the concussion, but suddenly you're just very, very ill with the fatigue. And the other way, which happens in about 40% of cases, is that it's a gradual change. It comes on gradually and you get sicker and sicker and sicker. And in that case, because it's so gradual, especially, in my circumstance, I had no idea this was coming, and the symptoms were very vague. So this insidious onset, which happens in about 40% of cases, is what happened to me. And I had back-to-back flus. And the second time, I never fully felt like I got back to 100%. So I was like 90%, but, I was pretty good, but I just didn't fully feel like I had my energy back. And I was a really active and really healthy person. Like I ate pretty decently. I slept 8 hours a night. I didn't have kids. So I, had a pretty, like ordinary life. And I exercised a lot. Like I would run for a few times a week. I would cycle to work. I would walk a lot. So I didn't understand why all of a sudden I was just having, a lot of days where I was just kind of too sick to do anything. I didn't have any symptoms. I just was so tired. I couldn't go and do anything. And I kept thinking, I must be coming down with something. And that was always my explanation. But then I was getting other weird symptoms, like one of the weirdest symptoms, because chronic fatigue isn't just fatigue. It comes with this whole kaleidoscope of symptoms that come and go. And everybody's experience with it for that reason can be really distinct and different. But one of the symptoms I got was alcohol intolerance. So I would have, 1 glass of wine in the evening, and I would feel like I drank a cup of sand. And I would have, a gallon of water and I'd still feel really parched. And I just thought, oh, I guess I'm like 33 years old. Like, I guess I'm just getting old and I can't drink as much as I used to. But yeah, later I learned that was one of the symptoms. So getting sicker. I started to go to the doctor. Because there's no test for chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a diagnosis by exclusion. So we had to test for pretty much everything under the sun. We did 6 months of testing. And by that time, by the end of those 6 months, I was really sick. I was in fact too sick to get out of bed. It affects the body cognitively and physically. So I had a lot of brain fog. My short-term memory was just destroyed. So I couldn't read because I would start a sentence. And by the time I got to the end of that sentence, I couldn't remember what the start was. So I couldn't make any sense of the words in the sentence. And I physically, I needed help to get out of bed. Some people end up completely bedbound, and I never quite got that bad. But there was a lot of days where my husband had to help me get out of bed because otherwise I couldn't do it on my own. And that was 2017 that it really came on full time. And I obviously all aspects of my life were shut down. I was involved in a public speaking club that I helped to run. I had to quit that. Obviously had to quit exercising. I just couldn't see any of my friends. And then with my job, luckily I worked for a really lovely not-for-profit organization, and they said, look, just come in when you can, when you're able to. We'll have someone looking after your work. And if you could just come in and help her out when you're able. So I was going into work about 2 mornings a week for, 2 or 3 hours. And I would go to work, help this person, and I would go home at lunch and I would be unable to move for the next 36 hours. It would take me that long to recover from working for 2 or 3 hours in an office. So that's how bad it was for about a year and a half. And since then, I've been very, very gradually getting better. So I'm now at the point where I can work 6 hours most days, depending on, where I'm at with things. So that's huge for me. That's a really big deal compared to only being able to work, 5 or 6 hours in a week. So, but I still have to be really, really careful. I think the things a lot of people experienced during COVID, staying home all the time, not seeing your friends, not being able to do things you really love, not being able to go to the gym. That was my life for 3 years before COVID. So by the time COVID came, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I know what this is like. I'm used to it. The one thing though, I will say, is that I was so glad I had developed a creative practice before I got sick, because when I was home by myself day after day, my husband was at work and he works long hours, so I would be home a long time by myself. When I was well enough to do a little bit of writing, when I got past that really bad period and I was able to then start doing a little bit again in the day, being able to sit down in the middle of a book that I had started before I got sick, my memoir, How to Be Australian, I started that before I got sick. And I was so relieved to have that to take me away from thinking about the illness, from thinking about my life. It was an incredible refuge. And I think that's another reason why when I teach creativity, I talk about how healing it can be. And there's actually science to support that. I have a podcast where we talk about writing, creativity, and health. It's called James and Ashley Stay at Home. I do it with another author who also lives with chronic illness. And the joke is that we were staying at home before it was cool. And we interviewed an art therapist, and she works with first responders and military personnel who have PTSD. And she talked to us about how engaging people in their creativity, that's a strategy that can help them overcome things like post-traumatic stress, because it allows you to connect with the subconscious and it allows you to express things that may otherwise be inexpressible. So I feel, I mean, obviously it was terrible. It was terrible luck that I got sick. You know, it was a terrible thing to happen. But on the other hand, a positive that I took from it is that I really, really knew that writing was the right thing for me, because it made me feel so much better. And it has been there supporting me throughout. And now I've written, you know, my next book, I wrote entirely while I've been sick. And so it's taken me a little while, you know, it's taken me 3 years, but I wrote a book that, you know, I wrote the book that I wanted to read. I wrote a book that I felt was really engaging and really exciting and surprising. It's a psychological thriller. And now I have agents, you know, I have a literary agent in the US and the UK and here in Australia, and it's going out to publishers. And so I feel like despite the illness, or even because of the illness, I've still been able to build up my creative career and my creative practice. And I believe it's really, really helped me with my recovery.
Well, let's talk about writer's block. How do people shut down writer's block and unlock their creativity?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. So writer's block is, it can depend on the person. There's a couple ways of looking at it. One thing about writer's block is that it might be coming from a really emotional place. And what I mean by that is you might have lots of ideas, but when you sit down to work on them, you might feel like all the emotions that come with writing are stopping you from engaging with those ideas. So a really common thing is that people feel imposter syndrome. When you start writing, you don't have the skills, you know, to do the kind of writing that you see getting published. Your writing is going to be amateurish, and that can make people feel like, oh, well, obviously I'm not meant to be a writer because I'm not good at it. And you need to take a lot of heart in pushing past that phase. The only way to get better is to do a lot of practice. Like just like with anything, starting a new sport or learning a new skill, you've got to put in the hours, and you've got to take classes or figure out, you know, read books about how to develop those skills, figure out how to develop those skills for yourself. So your writer's block might be that emotional stuff, that fear of, oh, I'm not good enough. And every writer has that. Even, you know, lots of established writers. Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, she talks about how that fear of not being good enough and of not being able to make the writing as good as you want it to be, that fear is always with her. And so it's about learning to recognize that fear and telling it to just take a backseat, step to the side. It's still going to be there, but don't let it stop you. Don't let it prevent you. Don't let it control you. And so I think learning about how other writers have had to deal with that. And it's the same for me. I had to deal with that as well. I think that is really important. The other thing writer's block could be originating from is genuinely that you just haven't trained yourself to connect with your ideas. So you might feel like, oh, I don't have any ideas. I don't know what to write. Like I've heard people say, I really want to write, but I don't know where to start. I don't know how to start. So first off, you have lots of ideas. Trust me, your brain is coming up with ideas. You're just not tuning into them. And so it's just a process of training yourself to tune into those ideas, which is really exciting. So one of the things I teach, and this is, you know, I do creativity workshops, and this is what we do in the workshop, is the rules are, we're going to do an exercise. I'm going to set a timer, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever it is. And once that timer starts, you start writing. You start moving your pen, or, if you're typing, moving your fingers. And you don't stop until the timer goes. Even if you can't think of anything, even if all you can think of is, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to write, I'm stuck, why am I doing this? That's okay, just keep going. Because usually what happens is while you're writing out that, while you're allowing yourself to express that idea, your brain will come up with something else. And so, let's say the prompt is just describe an ordinary day for yourself when you were 5 years old. It could be anything. You just start writing. And maybe while you're writing that, you have some, great idea about something that happened, not when you were 5, but when you were 28. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. I just remember this thing that happened when I was 28. And that could be a great idea for a story, a memoir, a poem, whatever. And you just keep writing about that. And I think my theory is that doing that kind of generative writing allows your subconscious to express itself more directly. You're directly connecting with the subconscious. And so you're accessing all the ideas that it's always coming up with. Like, that's all it does all day. So my students, it's so great to see them, because we do these exercises and they just have these remarkable looks on their faces because they come up with this amazing stuff that they didn't know they were capable of, and they get really excited. So I recommend that kind of generative writing, even if you don't want to be a writer, you want to paint, or like you want to do theater or whatever it is. That generative writing is a great way to connect with what's going on in your brain and to access your ideas. So depending on what aspect of writer's block is stopping you, it could be both those things, but there are strategies and techniques to overcome that.
Well, tell us about any upcoming projects that you're working on that people need to know about.
Well, like I said, I teach creative writing. I do a lot of that on Zoom. I do a lot of Zoom workshops, and that technically means people from anywhere in the world can join, depending on the time frame, whether it suits them or not. It might be in the middle of the night, depending on what country you're in. But I do lots of creative writing workshops and author events as well. So you can visit my website, ashleyKalagianBlunt.com, and go to the events page and check out the events that I have upcoming. My 2 books are available. My first book, My Name is Revenge, which is the one about the Armenian genocide and the terrorist attack here in Sydney. That book is also an audiobook, so that's available. And in terms of upcoming projects, so like I said, my next book, my 3rd book, is out with publishers right now. So we're waiting to hear back, but I'm hoping to very soon be announcing some exciting publishing news for that next book. But right now that's all under wraps. But I'll be doing, when that book comes out later this year, next year, I'll be doing a lot of events around that, and hopefully some in the US as well.
Well, you gave out your website, so give out your social media links so people can stay connected with you and see what you're going to be up to.
Yeah, I'd love to connect with people on social media. I'm definitely the best on Instagram and Twitter, at a Kalagian Blunt. You can just go to my website and click through to everything. I've got all the links there. And I'm in theory on Facebook, but not using it as much. So Twitter and Instagram are definitely where my best content is. Like I said, I also do a podcast, James and Ashley Stay at Home. We interview authors and other creatives. We interviewed American author Sarah Centillis recently, and she was talking about her philosophy of creativity. And she believes that creativity is a radical act. She said that when we engage with our creativity, we can remake the world. And she is fantastic. So if you check out James and Ashley Stay at Home, and you can find that through all my social media. I share quotes from the authors that we speak to and try to promote the great work that they're doing.
All right. Well, close us out with some final thoughts. Any extra tips you might have for writers or anything that I left out that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I think just going back to where we started in terms of career, I started out with that idea that I was going to be a writer, and I was going to get published and I was going to make money from it. And so I had a lot of years where I was really unhappy, and actually I really felt like a failure because I wasn't getting published. I didn't have a book out in the world. I would go into bookshops and I'd feel a lot of despair. And I think it's because I went in with the wrong mindset. I went in with the idea that all I have to do is write a book and get it published, and then that will change my life. I will then be a writer as my career. And I think that's a really discouraging way to think about creativity. And if I could go back in time, what I would tell myself is, you should do all the writing and try to write the book, but do it because you love it. Do it for that reason first, and make your money elsewhere. Don't think about this as a career path yet. I would give myself 5 years, maybe even 10 years to develop those skills and to have fun doing it, because it would have been so much easier and so much less stressful. And I think it would have happened faster if I hadn't put that pressure on myself. And I didn't know any better. But that would be my key advice to people, is engage with your creativity because you love it first and foremost. And then if you want it to be a career, give yourself the time to develop the skills. Like, it's going to take time. We have this idea, I think, in popular culture that these things happen overnight, and occasionally they do, but that's like the lightning strike. That's like the 1 in 1,000. Don't bank on that, because you'll make yourself miserable. And I've seen so many people do that as I did. But yeah, I really wish I could go back in time and give myself that advice, because I would have been much more happier, and I would have ended up in the same place, maybe even faster.
And I think that goes the same for podcasting. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashley Kalagian Blunt. Ashley is a great teacher and a great author. So you guys be sure to check out her books and follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. Also, Android listeners, go to the Google Play Store and download the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast app. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ashley.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
For more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, visit www.curveball337.com. Until next time, keep living the dream.